Hey, what's up guys? As always, I hope you're doing great. Today we're going to talk about The Eternaut, a science fiction series from Argentina recently released on Netflix that honestly is quite good. In this video, we'll try to provide a realistic explanation for the lethal snow or ash that appears in this show and that represents the most important threat the survivors have to contend with, at least initially. We will not only analyze how plausible the official explanation is, but we will also explore several viable hypotheses to better understand the nature of this phenomenon. By the way, this is a spoiler-free video, so you don't have to worry about that. And with that said, and as always, let's get some context. For those unfamiliar with the source material, The Eternaut or El Eternauta is originally a science fiction comic series from Argentina, written by Héctor Germán Osterheld and illustrated by Francisco Solano López, that has recently been adapted into a Netflix series, which is the version we will be focusing on in this video. Without getting into spoilers, the story takes place in the city of Buenos Aires and follows Juan Salvo, a Malvinas War veteran, as he tries to survive and protect his family and friends amid a mysterious apocalyptic-scale catastrophe. It all begins on a summer night with what appears to be a city-wide blackout and a sudden drop in temperature that quickly is followed by anomalous weather events, auroras, thunders, and most notably a sudden snowstorm, something that is especially strange in the hot summer nights. But as you can probably guess, things are not what they seem. The blackout is much more than just a power outage. It is actually the complete failure of all digital equipment. Not only is there no electrical supply, but even battery-powered devices like cell phones and modern vehicles stop working. Compasses fail too, indicating something much deeper is happening. At the same time, the snow falling from the sky is not such a thing. It doesn't melt under heat, and more importantly, it causes instant death on contact with the skin. This so-called snow kills large numbers of people in a matter of minutes, causing mass panics, accidents, and chaos, becoming the primary threat to people during the early days of the catastrophe, even more so than desperate or violent survivors. Over time, other threats emerge: insect-like creatures that live in hives, asteroids, and even assassins and psychopaths, all wrapped in layers of mystery. But as I said, to avoid spoilers, let's focus back on the snow. This threat has some peculiar characteristics. It doesn't melt, but instead seems to denature or degrade quickly after falling. It turns opaque and loses all of its lethality shortly after settling. Now, there are a few explanations offered to us in the series. Initially, it is suspected that this phenomenon might be due to a nearby industrial fire that's releasing toxic ash, possibly asbestos, but this is quickly dismissed due to the scale of the events. Later, a more detailed explanation is introduced, relying on a classic sci-fi trope: radiation. We are told that the toxic snow is actually radioactive material coming from the upper layers of the atmosphere. Specifically, the particles are said to come from those trapped by the Earth's magnetic field, collectively forming what we know as the Van Allen radiation belts. At first glance, this might sound like a fairly convincing explanation, especially since it aligns quite well with the electromagnetic anomalies we see. The failure in electronic devices and compasses implies that Earth's magnetic field is either disrupted or has stopped functioning altogether. On the other hand, it is also true that there are certain types of radiation considered low penetrating against which we could protect ourselves using relatively thin layers of material, such as those used in the improvised suits worn by the survivors in the series. To be precise, I'm talking about alpha and beta radiation. Alpha radiation consists of the emission of particles called alpha particles, composed of two neutrons, electrically neutral, and two protons, positively charged, all tightly bound together. Alpha particles therefore carry a net positive electric charge, have mass, and are relatively large in size. Beta radiation, on the other hand, involves the emission of electrons, which also carry mass and a negative electric charge. Because the particles emitted by these types of radiation possess both mass and charge, they tend to collide or be repelled by the atoms that make up not only human skin but also clothing. In fact, alpha particles can be blocked by something as thin as a sheet of paper. So, at least in principle, survivors could protect themselves from these types of radiation using their improvised suits. Now, the problem with this explanation is that precisely due to their low penetration in matter, the effects of alpha and beta radiation on the human body are mostly superficial superficial, producing burns that can be severe and very difficult to treat, but that don't align at all with the effects of the toxic snow, which causes near instant death, with almost no symptoms beyond the sudden loss of consciousness. So let's consider other forms of radiation. Gamma radiation involves the emission of high-energy photons which have no mass and no electric charge. There's also neutron radiation which, as the name suggests, emits neutrons, particles that have mass but no charge. Due to their lack in mass and/or electric charge, the particles emitted by these types of radiation are able to penetrate deeply into our tissues and, at a sufficient intensity, can cause what is known as cerebrovascular acute radiation syndrome, a condition in which our circulatory system stops functioning normally due to the acute damage to the autonomous nervous system that controls our blood vessels. This can absolutely result in a sudden loss of consciousness and even death, much like what we see with the toxic snow. But here's the issue. These forms of radiation penetrate matter very easily and are extremely difficult to block, even with thick concrete walls. In fact, shielding usually requires thick layers of high-density materials such as lead just to achieve a minimal level of protection. That clearly doesn't match what we see in the series. Another important point is the fact that the toxic snow rapidly denatures, losing its lethality within a very short time span. That's also inconsistent with what we would expect from a truly radioactive material that can still be dangerous for thousands or even millions of years. For all these reasons, even though the in-universe explanation involves radiation, I believe we are not actually dealing with a radioactive substance, but rather with a chemical weapon, a toxin that was intentionally dispersed into the atmosphere. Now, this might seem logistically implausible at first, and it is for humans, but in any case, one might think that a chemical attack on this scale would require thousands or even millions of tons of a toxic substance to kill as many people as the toxic snow did. But that is not necessarily the case. In the real world, we know of toxic substances that are incredibly potent and that could easily rival or even exceed the lethality of the toxic snow we can see in this show. The best example of this is without a doubt botulinum toxin. This substance is the strongest toxin known to science, a compound produced by a bacterium called Clostridium botulinum, causal agent of botulism. It has a medium lethal dose, or LD50, of just 1 to 3 nanograms per kilogram of body weight. To put that into perspective, 1 nanogram is 1 billionth of a gram, which means that with just 1 kilogram, or about 2 pounds of pure botulinum toxin, we could theoretically wipe out the entire human population with some toxin to spare. A toxin this potent could be distributed using a carrier material or excipient, which would serve as a delivery vehicle to facilitate widespread dispersion. And this in turn explains the high volume or large quantity of toxic snow that we can see. With a toxin this strong, most of the mass of the snow would actually just be inert material. Beyond all of this, botulinum toxin kills by causing flaccid paralysis. The muscles of those affected lose their ability to contract, and since our bodies rely on the diaphragmatic muscle to breathe, this results in a respiratory arrest, a failure of the ventilatory function. Also, this perfectly matches what we observe in the victims, whose only symptom appears to be sudden paralysis. As a side note, botulinum toxin is also better known as Botox, widely used for aesthetic procedures. However, this explanation is not without problems. Botulinum toxin cannot penetrate the skin directly. It is a protein large enough that it can pass through the skin barrier, and while it can be dispersed in aerosol form, in those cases it would enter the body through inhalation, not through the skin. The toxic snow behaves in a diametrically opposed manner. It doesn't appear to enter the body through the respiratory system. Gas masks are helpful but not essential for survival, and we often see characters breathing the ambient air without dying as long as they avoid touching the snow. This leads us to another key characteristic of this substance. wherever it is, it has a very low volatility, meaning it doesn't readily disperse in the air as vapor. On the contrary, it tends to remain solid, which is likely why it only kills through direct contact with the skin. And most likely, cold temperatures play a fundamental role here. Taking all of this into account, the toxic snow particularly reminds me of a group of substances known as nerve agents, the same class of chemical weapons that includes sarin, soman, and tabun, as well as the infamous Novichok agents and Biet's gas. Potent chemical weapons known for their controversial use both in warfare and in political assassination. These compounds, like botulinum toxin, are neurotoxic, fast-acting, and highly lethal, killing in the same way, by causing muscular paralysis that leads to respiratory failure. Among them, Novichok agents and their derivatives stand out for being low in volatility, easily absorbed through the skin, and remaining solid not just in cold weather but even at room temperature. So these are substances that closely match what we see. They are neurotoxic, paralytic agents, rapidly lethal, non-volatile, and capable of penetrating the skin. The only aspect that doesn't quite line up is the rapid degradation of the toxic snow. Novichok agents can remain viable for years, but of course, this doesn't have to be the same exact substance used in this case. Whoever is behind the apocalyptic events in the Eternaut clearly has the resources and probably the scientific knowledge to design their own nerve agents, tailor-made to suit their purposes. This would also help explain the sudden drop in temperatures that accompanies the deployment of this toxin. A substance that degrades this quickly, even in a cold environment, would likely denature almost immediately if it weren't deployed under low temperature conditions. The cold essentially preserves the toxin just long enough for it to produce its intended effects, decimate the population, instill fear, and force people to cluster together in desperate groups. Now, maybe this isn't the explanation we're given officially, but let's keep in mind that this explanation comes from a source that could easily be wrong. It is entirely possible that new information will come to light in the future, especially since the series has thankfully been renewed for a second season. Another point in this direction is the fact that if the original works, the toxic snow is not radioactive, but I wouldn't rely much on that, nor would I want to spoil anyone. If you liked this video, please consider subscribing, as it would help me immensely in keeping this channel alive. In any case, that's all from me now, and I'll see you all in the next video.